we are very fortunate to have some very knowledgeable and qualified people speaking, those on the speakers list, and some who will speak as we move into the more informal session afterwards. The first person to speak is David Dunnison. And David, I've only come to know in the last while. He's a resident of Salt Spring Island, and David is a forestry graduate by education. He's an acknowledged expert in clean energy technology and a naturalist at heart. His career has included changing sawmill practices in North America to reduce sawmill waste, as well as fighting unfair trade practices and going up against the coal lobby. So, inspired by his eccentric professors, he is constantly on the lookout for unusual Douglas-fir specimens, like the Douglas-fir Gary Oak acorn granary tree in a picture in his presentation. Do acorns really grow on trees and not from their branches? All will be revealed. David is driven by scientific curiosity and an insatiable appetite for technical scientific literature. He just powers through it. He was spurred into action on these issues by reading and questioning some facts being widely used in support of a variety of environmental protection programs in the trust area. So before I hand over to David, I have a question for you. Is it true that your forestry degree was obtained at Harvard? And then off you go.
You're muted, David.
So first major correction of the day. First fact check of the day. No, I did not get a forestry degree from Harvard, but I did have a classmate who thought this was the most wonderful thing, that we could all go to school there. As he said, once when I was there and once at a reunion, where else would I have gone that I could have met somebody from forestry? So apparently I was the curiosity of the class. Anyhow, can I share?
Yep.
Okay.
Away you go.
And you can see that okay?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you both, and thanks everybody who's participating. I've got a wealth of slides. I'm going to try and go through them quickly. This slide here, yes, apparently acorns do grow on trees. Those of you who thought they grew on branches, perhaps not, but actually this is the acorn woodpecker at work. The acorn woodpecker is known in the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone, but we don't regard it as a local species yet. And climate change may change that. So look forward to the future and see what happens. This set of slides I put together for a presentation yesterday to the IT Council. And it was driven by a concern with respect to how the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone had been defined and how that was being advertised. And the concern is, or was, or remains, that it's being overly constrained by the trust and others. And that's just not appropriate, and sort of it sets up false premises. And fundamentally, it allows you to question what they're doing and what others are doing. And even one of their science advisors just pointed out that you know it's not helpful to the cause. So here we go. So just to clarify, I changed these slides up from yesterday for those of you who actually did sit in on that. But so the BC portion is just the northern tip of a very large zone. The U.S. Forest Service has long recognized that. These three organizations do incorrectly state a limited range. There's been ongoing international efforts to harmonize ecosystem classification throughout North America. And climate change is going to make it even more important to accurately consider the full extent of the CDF. In fact, because of the wealth of knowledge we have in BC on the CDF and the implementation of it for forest practices is an incredibly useful tool that we have to really share with our partners in the States, but also for global efforts, or as an example. So this is just a quote from the text of Ecosystems of BC. And the very first thing you come to is location, and it says right there, you know, Washington, San Juan Islands, obviously for those of us on the Gulf Islands, they're, you know, as close as, well, even closer in some cases to some of the islands than some of the other Gulf Islands are. So the definition is very clear. It extends almost all the way to the bottom of Oregon. And this publication, you can see a date behind here. Maybe I can just get my laser pointer. There we go. So, and behind here I have a date. But so 1973, which is 3 years before the BC Forest Service adopted this system for its practices, the U.S. Forest Service was already acknowledging that this is obvious. The Coastal Douglas-fir Zone does extend through Puget Sound and down through the Willamette Valley. Okay, so a year ago, the Islands Trust put out a fact sheet campaign for all the trust areas, and 12 of them are in the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone, and they state what you see here, which I reprinted here, which is that it's only found in the Southeast Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, and the southwest coast of BC, and that is incorrect. I should say my presentation did seem relatively well received yesterday. Here are quotes we can see from both Raincoast and CDFCP, also saying the same thing. On Monday of this week, Raincoast put out a web article that has changed their stance. I haven't checked to see if they've changed their web page yet, but I sent them an email a month ago, and they finally did change it this week, or at least publicly acknowledge that it extends far beyond the border. This is a very important reference if you're looking to the history of it, and this comes from 2008. This is a very well done study, 2-year study. Most of the second year was paid for by the trust, and they state right in there that the CDF does go through Puget Sound with only the northernmost tip in Canada. And if you look at this map over here, you can see this is the project study area. So obviously the trust was not paying them to go outside of the trust area. And they put this map together. What's interesting about this map, I think this is the earliest usage you can find, but other organizations have since taken this map and just cut off, you know, anything below the United States. And it's kind of reminds me, I don't know if people remember, I think it was the BC ferries had the trays with the sheet of paper that was all unexplored southern area down there. I mean, it just doesn't really help your cause when you're making that kind of argument. Something I didn't show them yesterday, but this is from 2004, so this is before the Madrona report, and this is from NatureServe, which is the Nature Conservancy, which is one of the major international organizations, obviously. And there you see, that's the zone. Now I'm going to show you another representation of that. But in 2004, that was a pretty, you know, healthy assessment that, you know, it does extend a fair ways down. In terms of land area, most of the land area is down in the States. In 1999, was it 99? Well, the late 90s, NAFTA, part of NAFTA uniquely included a requirement to be able to assess environmental impact between the three nations. In order to do that, they had to harmonize the ecosystem classification. So the three countries didn't even use the same terms for soil. So soil type, even BC to Washington, we didn't use the same terms. So it took them 15 years, and they harmonized all of North America into a singular ecosystem classification, largely assisted by the system we use in BC because of how well constructed it was. But you can see here that they did put these into two subzones, if you will, but really that's the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone, all this blue area here. Okay, here's a more recent study. This is a very interesting study. So 2015, and this is related to climate change. These researchers wanted to be able to map expected changes due to climate change in this forest. And because we have so much data, as I mentioned, with respect to coastal Douglas fir, they said, well, let's use that. And first thing we'll do is we'll map it more accurately, or as accurately as we can, to all the climate knowledge we have down here. And this is what they did. And you can see how much bigger it is south of the border. Now, the center is really here, just south of Olympia, Washington. So again, all kinds of work trying to harmonize this and looking forward, what's the impact of climate change? We can use the system and the data, and we can, really, try and map what's happening. Finally, 2015, the IUCN, which is the, I have it written somewhere, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They are the authoritative body globally for the status of the natural world and the measures needed to safeguard it. And in their so they put out a set of best practice guidelines. One of them was transboundary conservation. And as they note in their publication, as you see here, approximately 1/3 of all terrestrial high biodiversity sites straddle national land borders. For this reason alone, there's a compelling need for neighboring states to collaborate. It becomes kind of obvious, but especially in our situation, again, the Gulf Islands, San Juans, we had to have the Chancellor of Germany draw the map to say, okay, those guys are on that side and these guys are on the other side. I mean, it's pretty arbitrary for anybody to make a boundary there. So if we're serious about declaring a climate change crisis, then it just makes sense that we follow this kind of guidance and not arbitrarily cut off at the US border, which, trees, plants, birds, butterflies don't really care about the border. Okay. So in summary, the earliest definitions always acknowledged it's just the northern tip of a large ecosystem. The U.S. Forest Service and Society of American Foresters, so the U.S. authorities, recognized that really early on. And ongoing effort to harmonize and studies into the impact of climate change now and expected into the future. How is it going to grow? Will it shrink? Does it go up the mountains? All these things. It's it's very important that we see beyond our border, that we look at what the ecosystem is and forget about political boundary. Anyhow, thanks for that part. Whew. Okay.
You're muted, Murray. So was I.
Yeah, thanks, David. Can I just take a moment? I didn't do some housekeeping for attendees. There is a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to submit questions. You can also use the chat function if you have, anything to ask amongst yourselves. I think most people have tuned into that. And we will take some sort of discussion questions at the very end. And you will be able to raise your hand or submit a question via the chat, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. So back to the presentation. Thanks, David. That was a very enlightening overview of ecosystem classifications and the place of the Douglas-fir Zone. So what I understand from that, I'm just talking as you prepare your next presentation, is that we are on the northernmost tip of a very extensive zone that crosses the border. And, the part of these Douglas-fir zone that we caretake is, we shouldn't be unduly alarmed by statements from the trust fact sheets that that this zone is only found on southeast Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, and the southwest coast of BC. That, in the grand scheme of things, we're on a very small northern tip of this zone. Is that more or less what you've tried to tell us, David? Yeah.
Exactly. We have a beautiful piece of nature at our doorstep, and it's unique in that it is at a doorstep. But Douglas fir trees grow all the way down through Mexico. This ecosystem is much broader than just our little piece of it here.
Thanks, David. And just carry on now with your second
Okay.
part. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And really, I'm going to build on that point, this set of slides, if you will. So this is the scariest part to put together in terms of there are a lot of data, and it can, folks can get quite emotional about it. But, and I spent a lot of time just trying to understand the numbers I was hearing that we can read. How many species are endangered, how many ecosystems are endangered. What does it all really mean? Are they recovering? Are they not recovering? Is everything declining? It's really hard to find any further information than just a big number. But in working through all that, the statements we have here really explain the data. So endangered species are found throughout Canada. Well, firstly, we're a really big country, so you expect that. But this particular article was really good to point out. In large part, that's because of the location of their northernmost ranges. So at the extremes, it's always going to be more sensitive. There's very few species we're going to have the most southern part of the range just by the fact that we kind of own the North Pole. Or at least the magnetic North Pole. But at the top of the range, sooner or later, the species isn't going to be there anymore. And that's where we are. Now, this map, I also find interesting. And in that we have many fewer unique species than other countries. And what's interesting is the Charlottes, in terms of Canada, are fairly high. The Rocky Mountains are fairly high, and over here in the Gaspé is fairly high. Down in the south coast here, well, we're higher than this part of northern Ontario, where I've actually put in solar projects. But it's so-so. It's in this range. It's not super high, which also doesn't come as a surprise if you think about the forest. So back to forest training. I remember my professors saying, look, if you go a kilometer, you'll see thousands of trees. But if you get down to the tropics, it might be a kilometer before you find the next tree of that species, right? So we have, a lot. So Douglas-fir for, kilometers, tens, thousands of kilometers in terms of all the way down to Mexico, maybe 10,000 or maybe not 10,000, but thousands of kilometers all the way down to Mexico. You actually see just broad swaths of the same tree. So no, we don't have high degree of variability or biodiversity that way, or these that many unique species. Surprising in that, I had to read it and go, of course, but that is the case. So this whole section, I spent a bit more time here. Just this really kind of rises to the surface as the key way to understand the data. So again, northern limit, and means we'll have fewer wildlife species. In this case, I'm quoting right out of the Coastal Douglas-fir chapter. This is the authority on the ecosystems of BC. Exactly the same thing as the previous slide. And that even when we have a lot of water birds here, only a few species actually breed here. So yes, we have an important part of the range, but it's an interesting balance of activities and situations. So looking at unique terrestrial vertebrates, same kind of thing. We're in a low range, okay, as compared to the tropics. Makes sense, but sometimes you need to see a picture. I'm saying for myself, you go, oh yeah, of course. Habitat loss, and this was a surprise, and we'll get into this a little bit later in more detail because I really wanted to understand this further, so I had to go do some more investigation. But as compared to India, we're doing pretty well. This is, to me, astounding. And China, in the Beijing area, but we're doing actually pretty well here. Our habitat is reasonably stable, notwithstanding we had some major changes with turn of the century 100 years ago. But generally pretty stable. And as I say, we'll look into that a bit more. Biodiversity hotspots, mostly through the tropics. California is the closest hotspot to us, and there is an open question as to what is climate change going to do? Does it move northward? Does it decrease? What happens here? And so, and then by inference or by extension, what happens to us? But relative to most, to high biodiversity spots in the world, we are not a high biodiversity spot. So now let's look at a horrible, scary table. This is one study on what's going to happen to the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone. And this appears to be the leading authority right now, or leading the thinking on it. There's a number of other studies, but this has thousands of citations. And what they felt with the conclusions of all their research is that Coastal Douglas-fir is going to grow under climate change. And the reasons are pretty straightforward, is that it's going to, increasing northward and upward, because as things warm up, we can go further north. As things warm up, we can go up the mountain slopes. So the zones that really suffer are alpine tundra, the boreal forest, anything that's subalpine or alpine, their ranges should suffer. But the two things that we know most about, because they're closest to us, the coastal western hemlock and coastal Douglas-fir, expected to increase. Now, I added the slide recently because I was showing my presentation to others, and they got at least as confused as I was when I first went through this stuff. So trying to make simple what is complicated, but I'm going to show you some status reports or status data on species and ecosystems. And there are 3 different classification schemes that are used. Even in BC, we have 2. Part of this comes from NatureServe, which does that. But so we have red and blue, which you'll hear a lot about, who's on the red list or who's on the red and blue list. And then we have a little bit better granularity here, which is critically imperiled, special concern, vulnerable, apparently secure and secure, and similarly in a global status. And what you're going to see as we move through the data is that in BC, this is kind of a common scenario. And again, because we're at the northern end of the CDF zone, is that things could be imperiled and critically imperiled in BC, but may well be quite secure globally. And I'll get into what does that mean with respect to the species themselves, but this is a very consistent pattern. So jumping right into it. First thing to start out with is a really big number of 200 odd species that were on the red list in BC. I said, well, okay, let me look at the data. So I've got spreadsheets full of the data. What happens when you do a search on the database? So this is not even a species issue or how we define it, but the database kicks back like all these, if it might occur in the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone, but it actually occurs mostly over in the Ponderosa Pine Zone, that's irrelevant. They'll spit it out to you. So it errs on overcount. The data gives you an automatic overcount. So you've got to go through and sort of weed out all the other zones. If we're only talking about the Coastal Douglas-fir, which, maybe if we're worried about a particular species isn't appropriate, but our conversation here on the Gulf Islands is, the question is, if you will, is our zone really that threatened? What are we responsible for, and what can we do something about? So I wanted to know what's in the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone. And in the Coastal Douglas-fir Zone in BC, there are 16 species on the red list. Then if you cut further down, you say, okay, back to the S1, S2, only 7 have habitat on the Gulf Islands, and 0 are unique to the Gulf Islands that are on the S1 list. Okay, interesting data point. Did not expect to find that, actually. It's just combing through the data. And here's an interesting example. So there are a number of species if you read through the last 20 years of reports on this stuff, some species come up over and over again. And this is just a typical case. So roughly faster, I've seen at least 2 or 3 publications and studies. It's currently listed red S2, so it's imperiled. But its global status is G4, G5, so somewhere between G4 and G5. So it's apparently secure and secure. And now, of course, here we have red, blue, yellow dots. Completely different reason, because that's just who went and found these things. And unfortunately, they used the same color scheme. But this is the range. You know, as far east as Colorado, as far south as Mexico, and yes, right here in the Gulf Islands, we have some. And so in Canada, you would say, wow, you know, if we do the border trick, remember that first presentation, and say nothing matters south of the border, all we care about is this, but that's just unreasonable with respect to what actually happens in the natural world. So the next thing I looked at, I took that Madrona report, and I actually had to hand write in all the data. It was a pain in the butt, just because of the format it came in. But then I was able to compare their list, 214, with the current list, 203, with exactly the same search parameters. So no change of how we search the database, same source of the database. This is what everybody uses in BC to get their data. And so back in 2008, 214. Now there's 2021, or in 2021, we have 203. What does that mean? So then I started to look and say, well, are they all the same? And this was a surprise. Did not expect this. 68 of them had improved status. Most of those went into the yellow or secure phase. And that was really weird. I mean, I thought. And now 13 have declined. So 13 went from yellow and are now in red and blue. And this just says how highly dynamic the situation is, which again is a bit of a point of frustration, because as you read these reports, and they kind of scare you. You're like, well, are we falling off a cliff? Are we stable? Are we improving? What's actually happening out there? And this, sure like to hear somebody who's actually studying this tell us more about that. Same thing with ecosystems. I don't think there'd been a change in the total number, but 3 had declined, 1 had improved. Now in this case, 1 is unique in BC on the Gulf Islands. It's in the park on Saturna. So to the degree we can start to protect it, formally protect it, it is in a protected area. Anyhow, but again, this quite more dynamic than I would have expected, especially as we progress through climate change. You think, well, should not be having more impact, but it's ups and downs. Okay, I'm almost at the end of this. We've done pretty well, actually, when we start to look at how much has been protected. So we have a target that we committed to internationally. The Gulf Islands are well ahead of that. It's partly skewed downward because on Thetis, for example, that includes Valdez, and all the First Nations lands are taken out in terms of what is protected. So there's kind of an imbalance there. Should they be included or not included? Anyhow, so let's just wrap this part up. Northernmost range, where we live, of most species and ecosystems. We have relatively few unique species. We have lower biodiversity than Vancouver Island or the mainland on the Gulf Islands. And a good example is, for those familiar with vine maple, it's really hard to find vine maple on the Gulf Islands. That does not mean it's endangered. It's, it is a perfectly secure species. It's one of my favorites. I'd like to see it. I don't understand why I don't see it. The species lists are highly dynamic. No threatened species are unique to the Gulf Islands. Few threatened species have known habitat on the Gulf Islands. Okay. Oh, Mary.
Yeah, got it. Thanks so much, David. I think you deserve several medals for plowing through those mounds of data and comparing and contrasting and digesting, so that we didn't have to.
So does the audience at this point.
Okay, yes. And so what I get from that presentation, and the first one, is that it is, as realtors say, location, location, location. You know, key characteristics of our location are that we're at the northernmost extent. We are on an island, and both of those factors, you know, the relative isolation, mean that we can never aspire to be a habitat diversity hotspot. I think one of your maps had those red areas. So, you know, there's a limit to the, yes, the lack of biodiversity is driven by our location. I
think if we become Costa Rica, we know that climate change has been incredible.
Yeah, that would be bad. So David, thank you so much for that. And I think you have something else to show us now. So what comes next?
So I'm hoping this puts us on a bit of a lighter note. The last few slides might not, but I promise to be quick here. I know I've said that more than I've necessarily practiced. So working on all the stuff that I put together earlier, now I had the basis, if you will. I could start to compare, you know, what the facts are versus what the statements are, and do they reconcile? So here are some of the statements that you can find on the trust site and other places. And one of the first ones that jumps out at me is 75% of the human population of BC lives in the CDF. Well, that didn't make sense to me. We'll get to that. And then the next one is almost half the CDF lands have been converted for human use. Well, okay, I'd like to see the data. You know, you may be able to convince me on that one, but I want to see the data. And then the final one is, you know, the CDF has the highest road density of any zone in BC. Okay, but are we putting our finger on the scale here? And what do the roads really look like on the Gulf Islands? Because that's not really high road density. So just wanted to ask, you know, look at that. So what is the CDF zone? CDF zone, the most recent August 2016 update. So the most current definition includes most of Richmond, most of Delta, a little bit of South Surrey, the Gulf Islands, you know, the Saanich Peninsula, all the area that we're familiar with, right? But it does not include most of Greater Vancouver. So it's hard to justify this particular statement with the data. It just doesn't reconcile. I challenge anybody to try and add up the numbers and get to much higher than 19% of BC. So that one doesn't really square with the data. And in this case, we kind of have to award it something. So I did. And if you will, we have this statement that the major centers of Vancouver, Victoria, and Nanaimo are included in CDF, whereas we know right from the government website, Vancouver is not included. So no, CDF does not include the city of Vancouver, the city of Burnaby, Port Coquitlam, etc. We'll look at that in a bit better detail here. So what about converted forest lands? Well, remember what I showed you in the lower mainland. Let's look at where Richmond was in 1870. Slough, grass, pine brush, cranberries, grass prairie, brush, flat prairie, swampy, reeds. It's not much of a forest. So suggesting that this has been converted, okay, maybe, but we are still growing cranberries where cranberries were, and we're still growing blueberries where blueberries were. Okay, maybe, yeah, we're using more of a horticulture variety, but seriously, this has not been converted from a forest. So there is a significant factual error here because this all represents 20% of the CDF as currently defined 2016 most recent data. Here's even a more accurate representation of you can find this. City of Richmond will tell you what this was in 1880, so 10 years, and all of this part here is prairie. We come up here and we start to see cedar, hemlock, cedar, hemlock, cedar, hemlock. Nope, that's not Douglas-fir forest. That's consistent with the definition. So, you know, over 100 years ago, that was not Coastal Douglas-fir. Today is not Coastal Douglas-fir. So again, that supports the fact that, yeah, that's not really a square assessment. And as we know, unfortunately, you know, today we absolutely completely reinforced here. It's a floodplain. Now we do have, this is 1894, the highest on modern record. And we have, you know, some big cottonwood trees here, maybe some cedars there, but some more cottonwoods. You know, that's kind of the situation in the Fraser Valley. So next question was highest road density. Well, there isn't a lot of road density in this portion. There's a lot of road density here. So how are you squaring this? And if you start to look at how people define these things, like here, you know, it's the rarest, it's very rare. Smallest by far, I think, is a statement I've seen. And they take out the lower mainland portion when they want to justify how small it is, and then add it back in when they want to justify how much road density it is. And that's just, you know, firstly, it's appropriate, but secondly, and maybe it really should be the opposite way, it's just irrelevant because we're not going to convert that back to forest ever, right? Yes, we may, you know, or blue orchard bees, you know, can we put little straws and stuff up for blue orchard bees? Can we do things like that? But we're not converting this back to forest land. We can do things in terms of biodiversity, but I just don't think it's appropriate to have these kind of gross overstatements, if you will, with this kind of comparison. It's really irrelevant to the cause. So that's selective truth telling. If you get a bunch of them, you know, it does add up. Now I wanted to add this example in. So looking very much at the positive, these guys do a fantastic job. It's an incredibly rich site. I was thinking I should write a paper on how to get rid of blackberries because I've spent more last 7 years refining the process. I think I've used every implement you can buy at Lee Valley Tools. And I can tell you which ones work better and how long they take. But you know what? These guys will tell you how to remove blackberries, when you should remove blackberries, when you shouldn't remove blackberries. They'll tell you that about broom. Maybe you shouldn't remove the broom on a Gary Oak meadow. Oh, that got my attention. I thought broom was just bad. You know, so actually, when you start to see this kind of information, it underscores, you know, how we have to be careful about the black and white, you know, bad, good kind of assessment. These guys do a great job. And look at what they say about the distribution of Gary Oak. They do not cut it off at the border. They have no map. I think I've seen on their site where they cut it off at the border. Even when they say BC only, they show it on the other side of the border. So they get a big check mark. Good job. But back to misleading. You know, the things I don't hear about much is, you know, this is what we should be discussing, because what's happening on our islands, in our forests, is we're just building fuel and deer browsing. We got deer we got to deal with, and protecting our infrastructure. Anyhow, with that, thanks.